morning. If you have your Bible and want to be turning to the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah chapter 9 is where we're going to start. It's so good to be together on the first day of the week. We are thankful for each and everyone who is here today, young and old, whether this is your first time to visit Broadmoor or if you have been coming here for years. What a blessing it is to be with God's people and to worship the Lord. Thank you to those who have already helped lead us in our worship, for the songs and for the words before we remembered Christ's death. And now we have an opportunity to look into one of the great books of the Old Testament, the book of Nehemiah, and see some of the amazing truths that God has left for us. Do you recognize the names Carter Braxton, Robert Morris, and Joseph Hughes? What about John Hancock, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin? All 6 of those men were of the group, the 56, that signed the Declaration of Independence, likely the most well-known document in American history. But why did they sign it? Each of them were delegates from one of the 13 colonies, the states. And they put their names on that document to show their approval, their support for the resolution that was being made. That the states, the United States, would no longer be subject to the rules and the oppression of Great Britain. We commemorate what they did in 1776 every 4th of July, and that's a celebration for us. There's fireworks and food, and we get together with friends and family. But that decision to sign the document would have been a difficult one for those men. They were, in a sense, putting their lives on the line to declare that they were going to break away from the crown was an act of treason. And if their attempts to gain independence were not successful, those men would have been captured and likely put to death. But they signed it anyway. They acted with courage. They took that bold step to put their names down on the paper. And that action forever changed the course of our nation. In Nehemiah chapter 10, we see that the children of Israel have come back from captivity. And they've been in the process of trying to rebuild the city, rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. But in chapter 10, there is this pivotal moment when the leaders and the congregation come together and they sign their names. They make a firm covenant, a resolution that they will no longer follow the path of their fathers and those who went before them, but that they will serve the Lord. And what we see in this document they're outlining here in Nehemiah 10 is really an effort to implement a practical faith. A real faith, one that is evident and visible in their everyday lives. Read with me from Nehemiah chapter 9, beginning in verse 38. Nehemiah 9:38, it says, "And because of all this, we make a sure covenant and write it, our leaders, our Levites, and our priests seal it. Now those who place their seal on the document were Nehemiah the governor, the son of Hakaliah, and Zedekiah, Sariah, Azariah, Jeremiah, Pashur, and I'm sure you want me to read the rest of the names. But these people come together to sign this resolution. In Nehemiah chapter 9, the people had come together for a great assembly, and there was a sense of sadness and mourning. Nehemiah 9 describes how they wore sackcloth, they threw dust on their heads, they were confessing their sins. And then it goes through and it lists all of the history of the children of Israel and how God had been so faithful to them. He had provided for them, but time and time again they had turned away. They had not followed the ways of God's laws. And so there was a great sense of sadness, of guilt, of remorse that the people were feeling in chapter 9. But despite what had happened in the past, chapter 10 starts with this change, this resolve to do better, to make a different path going forward. And so these leaders come together to sign this document, this resolution. These are the princes, the leaders, the Levites, and the priests. A couple of things to note about this list. There are 84 names here listed in Nehemiah chapter 10. Not sure if that number is significant for those of you who are doing calculations. 12 times 7 is 84. Maybe there's some significance there. But many of the names that are found in Nehemiah 10 are also listed in Nehemiah chapter 3. Nehemiah 3 describes the people who were part of the rebuilding of the walls, those who were helping with the construction. And what that shows us is that these people were not just interested in building up the city for their own personal protection, but they're focused on the spiritual rebuilding that needed to happen among God's people. Not just do I have a place to live that will be safe and secure, but will God's ways and his purposes be fulfilled among his people? And you'll notice the beginning of verse 1, who is it that is leading them in this? Who is out front helping God's people? It is Nehemiah, the governor of the people. Skip down with me to verse 28. After the list of names in verse 28, it says, now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple helpers, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of their God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone who had knowledge and understanding. These joined with their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and his ordinances and his statutes. Did you notice the word all in verse 28? It says that all those who had separated themselves, all of those who were old enough to understand. We first see that in signing this document, they gather all the people. This is not just a small group, a subset of the children of Israel, but this is the entire congregation that has come together. Their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone is there. Everyone is present. Sometimes we try to get an activity together here at the church. Someone might be trying to get a group to go hiking, or maybe they want to plan some type of outing where people are going to go camping. Do we get 100% participation when stuff like that gets announced? Is everybody hiking up to the top of that mountain? Maybe you're not physically able to do that. Maybe you just don't want to sleep on the ground out in the heat for a couple of nights. Not everyone is going to be a part of every activity that gets planned or that gets brought up. But when it comes to following God's word, that's something that we must be united in. That is a purpose that we can't just have some that are in, some that are out. That must be complete, 100%. Every person is devoted to serving and keeping his word. There's another all in verse 29. Verse 29, it says that they were going to observe all the commandments of the Lord. All the commandments. That sounds similar to Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 29. When Moses laid out all of the rules of the law of the covenant, and he describes how if the people keep those things, if they're faithful to God's laws, there will be blessings. But on the other side, if they turn their backs, if they do not walk according to God's ways, then there would be a curse. But the people in Nehemiah's day understood that partial adherence to God's law was not sufficient. It doesn't work to do the sacrifices, to keep the Sabbath, but then to lie or to cheat your neighbor. It's not enough to go and to present your offering in the temple, but then to have an idol back at the house. The Lord wanted them to offer their complete devotion. Also notice that they make a public declaration. They're not doing this in a secret meeting. There's an underground assembly and nobody is going to find out about what's going on here. They don't conceal the list of names that are signed on the document. I read that the Declaration of Independence, they didn't publish the names until a number of years, 10 years after it was first signed, because they wanted to protect those people. But here, Nehemiah and the people, they put their names out in the open. Everyone is going to see that this was something that was important to them. That's so important. We think about making changes in our lives, overcoming an obstacle, some type of sin that we're dealing with. What happens if we don't tell anyone about that? No one knows what we're dealing with, what we're going through. How likely is it that we're going to be successful in that? There's no accountability. There's no one to check up to see how we're doing, to see our progress, to see if we need some help or some type of support. If I told you that I wanted to read from the book of Ephesians every day in the month of July, or that I wanted to wake up early on Saturday mornings this next month to spend some time in prayer, if I make that public, there's an opportunity for you to encourage, to help, to support. And so when we're trying to move forward in our faith, we need to recognize the value of making that public statement, saying that this is something that I'm working towards. It doesn't mean perfection, but it is a sense of resolve that this is important to me, that we are going to make this a priority. Not only do the people commit to making this change, but in verses 30 through 39, they take it a step further. They identify specific areas. They don't just say, well, we want to worship God, we want to keep all of his laws, and then they go back on living their lives. They are now going to outline specific things that need to be changed. Things that were problem areas in the past, things where the children of Israel had slipped up. Maybe a law that had not been followed for a number of years. They're now recommitting themselves to do those things. They identify specific areas. When I was growing up, my grandmother had a piano in her front room. And she knew how to play, but didn't really ever go in there, so the kids would go in there. And I would play the forearm song. Have you heard that one? You take your forearm and you just bang it on all the keys. And I'd be in there for a couple minutes and then they'd chase me out. But as I got older, I wanted to learn how to play the piano. Now, if you heard a young person say that, well, I'd like to learn how to play. You might ask, well, do you have a piano? No, I don't. Well, are you taking lessons? No, I'm not. Were you watching videos on YouTube? Are you looking at tutorials? No, I'm not doing that. Do you have a book? Some type of book that you bought? No. Well, how are you going to learn the piano? It's not just something that you just have an idea about it and then it happens. And the same is true in our spiritual walk. If there's something that we're trying to overcome or accomplish in our walk with God, there has to be specifics. There has to be steps that are put in place in order for us to obtain a goal that we set for ourselves. The people in Nehemiah's day lay out exactly what they're going to do in order to rededicate themselves to God. Well, let's look at some of these specific areas as we make some applications from this text. Look at verse 30. In verse 30, it says, "We would not give our daughters as wives to the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons." We think about a practical faith and the areas of our life that is going to impact. One of the first places that it touches is in our relationships. It touches our relationships. They had vowed not to intermarry with the people of the land. This is not a racial or ethnic bias. This is a spiritual purity aspect. They didn't want the influences of the people of the land to dissuade them from following the Lord. In Exodus chapter 34 and verse 16, the Lord had warned Moses about the dangers of intermingling with the people of the land, entering into marriages, and the effect that could have. And the primary factor or concern in that was it drawing the people away from God. And we see that play out in the book of Judges with Samson as he's going after all of these Philistine women, and if they eventually cause him to break his Nazirite vow, he gives up all that God had blessed him with. His strength is taken away. The Spirit of the Lord departs from him, and ultimately he loses his life. Solomon was the most powerful king to rule over Israel. Tons of territory and wealth. God had blessed him with wisdom, and yet it was foreign wives that turned his heart away from the Lord. Nehemiah and the people understood that if they were going to remain fully devoted to the Lord, they couldn't just go and join themselves with the people of the land in this way. Does our connection to God, does our faith, our conviction, does it impact our relationships? Does that change who we spend our time with, who we most closely align ourselves to? When I was in high school, I had a friend that he always had a saying that he would use. Every time he saw something that was very impressive, and when I say impressive, I mean like he got an extra slice of cheese on his hamburger. But he would say, "That's unreal." And he would get a good seat in the theater and he'd say, "That's unreal." And I never really understood that because it was real. It had just happened and he saw it, but that's unreal. And after a while, I found myself, I'd be watching a baseball game and somebody would make a great catch. And I'd say, "That's unreal." And I couldn't believe it. Our friends influence us more than we realize. In the way that we think, in the way that we talk, and in the way that we act. Are we careful about the people that we connect ourselves to? And if that person is having a negative impact on me, are we willing, like these people were, to say we are going to separate ourselves? We're going to make a firm resolution to draw a line to protect our faith. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33 says, bad company corrupts good character. That's a general principle that is true, that for God's people, we need to be careful with those that we surround ourselves with. Also, notice verse 31. It says, if the peoples of the land brought wares or any grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day, and we would forego the seventh year's produce and the exacting of every debt. We see that a practical faith also impacts our finances. The people of the land didn't observe the seventh day. The Sabbath day wasn't anything important to them. It wasn't a special or holy day. That was just another day for business. Shops are open. They're bringing out their goods and their grain and their services. They're trying to make some money off of God's people, setting up their booths and offering for the people to come and buy. Do you see how God's people might have justified this? Going to buy from these merchants? Well, we're not working. We're not the ones that are doing any kind of work. We're just purchasing what they have provided. What if they're offering some kind of Sabbath day discount? 10% off today only. Does that change? Does that change their circumstance? God had told them that the seventh day was a day of rest. Not for buying and trading, not for getting ahead for the next week, but they were to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. We don't keep the Sabbath in the same way that they did, but we do have a special day and time to honor and to worship our God. A regular time where we come together to offer up worship to the Lord. It used to be that Sundays were sort of a protected time for family and for faith, especially in this part of the country. Businesses were closed. You wouldn't even imagine scheduling a sporting event on a Sunday because people were busy. They had another commitment on that day, but now it's just become a second Saturday. But how do we respond when the culture pushes like that? When it seems like things never slow down, they never stop to give honor and recognition to God? Do we keep our commitment, or do we just say, well, something else is going on. Somebody's selling in the market and it's a great deal I can't pass up. They were committed to the Lord. By keeping the Sabbath, by not planting and harvesting, by forgiving these debts in the seventh year, that had an impact on their finances. Can you imagine not working, not bringing in any income for an entire year, the seventh year? And yet that's what God told them to do. To let the land rest, to forgive the debt that was owed to them. And what that did was it forced them to trust God, to rely on Him, that He was going to continue to provide for them. He would give them enough in that sixth year and the following year so that they would be provided for. Are we willing to serve God even when there's some type of financial implication? I remember when I was in college, the gas one summer had gotten up to over $4.50 a gallon. And for a college kid, that starts to hurt. When we would go fill up at the tank, it was $80 a tank to fill up. And there was a singing that we had gone to every year, and we were talking about whether or not we're going to drive down to the singing, and I hesitated and thought, I don't know if I can afford that. Do we make financial sacrifices for God? Practical faith is one that impacts our actions, our attitudes, and our resources. giving back to God, offering to him what he has blessed us with. Practical faith also changes our priorities. Look at verse 35. It says, and we made ordinances to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all fruit of the trees year by year to the house of the Lord. The law required the people to give their first fruits to God. It was acknowledgement that God is the source of everything that they had. He's the creator, and so they gave back to him first. In Genesis chapter 4, Abel is described as bringing the firstborn from his flock. And God he was pleased with Abel's offering. How could they give up the first of their crop, the firstborn of their flock? They had to trust God, trust that another animal would be born, that more crops would come, that he would continue to provide for them. But offering the first fruits speaks to priorities. Does God get the first of our time, our energy, our resources, our devotion? Where do the first fruits of our life get directed? When I was in college, there was a Chick-fil-A that was opening up. And it was going to be the closest one to the campus. And everybody was excited. And the owner of the restaurant decided to do a promotion. He said that the first 100 people that came in on the first day would get free Chick-fil-A for a year. And you would not believe how many college students went to camp out, sleeping in tents in the rain, in the heat, in the parking lot. I remember driving by and looking at the little hobo camp that was set up there and thinking, it's just a chicken sandwich. And yet they were willing to do that at the chance, the opportunity for some free food for a year. Now imagine if the elders had closed the doors to the church and they said, the first 100 people in this next Sunday are the only ones that can worship for the next year. Everybody else has to stay away, but 100 people can come and be in the assembly for the next year. Are you camped out? Are you waiting outside the doors? It's so valuable to you that you would do whatever it took so that you could come and be with God's people. Does the Lord get the same amount of energy and effort as our hobbies, our schoolwork, our career? Are we giving the Lord the same attention that we give to our families and our homes? These people were focused on their priorities. They said, God is going to get the first of what we're blessed with. And finally, a practical faith is one that focuses on habits. Look at verse 39. It says, for the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the offering of the grain, of the new wine, of the oil to the storerooms, where the articles of the sanctuary are, where the priests who minister and the gatekeepers and the singers are, and we will not neglect the house of our God. For so many years, God's temple had been in ruins, and the worship had just fallen apart. It didn't even exist. In Haggai chapter 1 and verse 4, the prophet said, is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses while the Lord's house lies in ruins? And that was years before this, but now the temple has been rebuilt and things are starting to get back in place where they need to be. And the people here in Nehemiah's time, they say, we're going to make sure that this continues. Not just for a single feast, but we're bringing in the wine and the grain and the oil. And they talk about bringing in the wood in verse 34 for the sacrifices. We want to make sure that there's enough supplies to keep this going, so that there can be regular, ongoing worship in God's house. In other words, they wanted a habit to be formed. That this would be regular, constant, everyday activity that would be a part of their lives. Many of our young people just came back from a week at camp. It's one of the most anticipated times of the year. Most of them look like they've recovered. Some of the older counselors that were there, they look like they're still recovering. But that's a special time. There's opportunity for studies every single day. There's devotions, there's singings. I heard from some of them that the lessons and the time together was so moving that they found themselves crying multiple times throughout the week. And that's a special time. You're growing closer to your friends. You're growing stronger in your faith, but then camp ends. And you go back home. Instead of being around all of these people and focusing on spiritual things, now you're with your siblings. And you're at the house. A practical faith is one that's not just present for a single week in the summer. It's not just strong when I'm in the congregation and we're singing, but one that moves us every day of the week. It's present year-round so that we can say, as they did during Nehemiah's day, we will not neglect the house of our God. Do you have a practical faith? God's word is so helpful in shaping and forming our minds. It's something that we need to be meditating on constantly so that we can be more like his son, so that we can be better servants in his kingdom. We're going to close with a song and an invitation. If there's something that we can do to encourage you in your faith, in your walk with Christ, please use this opportunity as together we stand and sing.